The headlines. A 20-year-old man seeking to prosecute the Queen for the coronavirus crisis has had his day in court. Speaking to the media in the morning, the young man said, "After all I've suffered, after all we've all suffered, after I lost my job, and after I got the disease myself, it's high time the person in charge was made to pay." However, when told by the judge that the sovereign cannot legally be prosecuted, the man started yelling abuse and stormed angrily out of the court, only to run into Her Majesty in person outside. Witnesses report that the young man's expression went from rage to complete gormlessness in a matter of seconds, as Her Majesty offered him a cup of tea. Apparently, after a conversation between the two of them, the man's prosecution was dropped, and his protest movement, Blame Liz for the Miz, was officially dissolved. "I see now that the person I've blamed isn't so bad," he commented. "I still don't understand what happened, but I think I can trust her." Rumours that 3 local idiots who tried to get him to blame himself for his illness have been appointed as hospital chaplains in the area have been strenuously denied. My name's Andy, that's all fake news, and you're watching Alverstoke Antiviral. Well, I'm joined here today with Steve Pethick. Steve, a face many of us will know from AEC. Steve, it's good to see you. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, not bad, thanks. Not bad, thanks. Yes. Steve, I suppose many people will be wondering how lockdown has been for yourself and the Pethicks.
Yeah, it's been hectic. We moved house just before lockdown. We moved house on the 14th of February with quite a lot to do on the house. We bought it as a sort of a project. So lockdown's been great for the house. We've had lots of time to bash through a lot of those jobs. It's been really interesting. Some of the things we bought the house for was, it's got 2 entertaining rooms. It's got a family room that I'm in now, and next door a large lounge. And when we saw it, we thought, oh, it'd be perfect for having people from the church round. And for the first sort of, 3 months we owned the house, we haven't had anyone round. So our plans and God's plans, obviously not the same there. So that's been quite interesting. Had the girls home for school most of the time. We did 10 weeks of homeschool. And then when the schools reopened, they were able to go back. So it's been different, but been enjoyable.
Yeah, I remember you sawing up your floor at one point and doing all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, you guys came around for music practice, and I was taking up the floor in the front room. I've had to take that right back to the rafters, so all of the joists are out, everything. It's
almost like a house is a learning experience. You sort of move in and then you discover all these things about it, and all these things.
Yeah, I mean, we had a survey that identified a couple of things, and we thought, okay, we'll get those done. And the other sort of 8 or 9 things that we found, we weren't planning to do, but we've done them, so it's fine.
Yeah, and of course, there's the famous garden, isn't there? Which looks completely different.
Yeah. Yeah, so the bottom, I'd say, third of the garden, the people that owned the house before us had never been in it, because the people that they bought it off 8 years ago had left a load of old brick rubble and stuff around the garage. So they'd never been in the garage. The roof had fallen in on that. So we had all that rubble cleared, reconstituted the garage roof, took part of the wall down so you can now park 2 cars on the drive. So put a fence up, put a pond in. The girls were given by my mum veg flowers to plant, and by Abby's mum seed flowers to plant. Every single one of the things grew. So that meant we had to dig a vegetable patch and a flower patch, which I wasn't planning to do for ages, but they had these plants to go in, so we've now got a vegetable patch one side and flowers the other.
So it's now a self-sufficient commune where vegetables are.
Yeah, I'm tempted to get a goat, but Abby doesn't really want that, so...
Well, I suppose that would keep some of the veg growth down. Well, they eat everything, don't they, goats? So...
Yeah, but you can milk and then eat them, so we'd be completely self-sufficient eventually.
You can have cheese under your floors growing and, maturing and the...
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Something like that. Yeah. And what does, now that school is sort of over, did you have plans for the summer? And do you have plans for the summer now?
Yeah, so this summer's going to be radically different to what we normally do. So normally we do Scout Camp, which is 8 days at the beginning of August, and Cub Camp, which is 4 days at the end. Scout Camp is normally, the last one was on the Isle of Wight or up in sort of Guildford way. We've done a couple recently. So it's load everything into a box trailer and transport up there. So there's not just the 8 days you're away, there's the loading of the kit beforehand, there's the loading of the kit afterwards. The Cub Camp's at our own headquarters, so there's like getting the site ready, making sure it's all mowed and there's no brambles or anything about for the kids to get caught up in. And then there's a sort of breakdown and cleaning it back afterwards. None of that is able to happen. So there's sort of 14 extra spare days, which I don't normally have. So that's going to be quite interesting. We're still able to go to Centre Parks in a couple of weeks' time. So that's been good. That's been a real sort of watch the website, as they've been cancelling more and more and more. And then they were letting people in, and now the swimming pool might even be open by the time we get there. So that should be really good.
Right. Have you been before?
So Abby's family every year do a big sort of reunion. So Abby's one of 3 girls. One of her sisters has got 4 kids, and Abby's mum and dad, and they all tend to pile somewhere to get. So we've done Centre Parks twice, Devon twice. We've done a couple in Holborn, Nation, Hampshire. So I think this is about our 12th year.
And is everyone coming?
Possibly not. The Emma Ruth who lives in London, her husband, his gym might reopen just about the same sort of time, so he may not be able to come down, but possibly. So he's a bit not sure, but everybody else should be descending.
Oh, good. Well, I hope you get a bit of a breakaway, and I mean, I suppose it'll be interesting to see how normal a place like that is. But then, you know.
Yeah, so we're not allowed to just rock up to the swimming pool, which is what we would normally do. We've got 2 time slots, so one on the Tuesday, one on the Thursday. But then hopefully, because there'll be fewer people in the swimming pool, we'll be able to do all of the flumes and stuff without queuing. So it should be different, but hopefully good different, rather than, you're not allowed in there very often, but you still queue as much.
Yeah, you don't have to have 12 people, jostled up in the same jacuzzi trying to enjoy the bubbles.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Speaking of jacuzzis, how's the hot tub?
Yeah, it's on its final stage now. So there are sort of 5 bits to a hot tub that need to work. I've replaced the top side controller. I've replaced the mains control pack and the motherboard. I changed all the pumps yesterday. So what we've got left is the heating. But the actual tub itself has always been good. So that's it. So I'm working on the heater today. I've just put a new one in, or a second-hand new one. And hopefully it'll be hot. It's a tub at the moment that sprays and does all the jets and stuff, but it's cold, which is pretty useless.
Yes, maybe in a hot country that could be useful, but perhaps not in gospel at this time. And Steve, how have you been sort of spiritually as well? Have you been learning anything? Has God been teaching you anything over this time, or have there been things on your mind?
So one of the verses that I sort of cling to, or sort of really rely on and keep coming back to, is in Deuteronomy 6, 6 and 7. It talks about the commands I've given you today should be on your hearts. Impress them upon your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk on the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And it's been great to be able to do that during lockdown, because I've had the kids so much around. I can talk to them about almost anything. So it's been really useful to do that. I'm doing Acts with Life Group, and I'm doing Acts with the girls as well, because it just makes more sense for me to just concentrate on Acts. So it's been great to be with them. But I found it harder to do my own daily Bible routine, because stuff has been so different and it's been so thing. So I've started to use this book. I said started to use it. I've done 4. So I've literally just started to use it. But it's a daily Bible reading book. And what's nice about it is the passages in it. So I don't have to find my Bible. It's all in there. It's got the questions in it and everything, so I can just work through. And the other thing I like about it is it's not dated, so that I don't feel guilty because I've missed 4 days and have to flick back and have to like do 100 days in a row. If it doesn't work out because where we've been, so I'm just able to work through. So I've been doing about 4 studies in Judges in that, so that's been really useful.
Oh, great. I was thinking about Judges this morning actually for some reason. Most of the end of Judges and the sort of chaos and sin that we talked about when we did Judges on Antiviral. But yeah, have you been looking at the start or the middle or?
So it starts with looking at the end of Joshua's time and what Joshua was told to do. And looking through, it was very clear what God said to do, and the people were very clear, yes, we'll do it, we'll 100% commit to it. And now it's working through, well, this is what the people did. And it didn't really work. And here's the result of it. So that's been interesting. And that also is one of the reasons I was thinking about. It's so important that if we commit to say to God, we are going to do this, if we don't, we shouldn't expect things to go well. So if it's a duty of parents to teach their children about God, to show them the right way to live, if they don't do that, I shouldn't expect it to go well for the girl. So there's a silly phrase in there, you've got to be in it to win it. So that's why I think it's important that we, or Abby and I, teach our girls, and hopefully, by God's grace, they understand it and follow it.
Yeah, and it's I imagine it's the sort of thing where obviously depending on God as well for that, and prayer is really important, but not letting that be an excuse for not actually being proactive as well, in seeking to make God known and to talk about him.
Yeah, no, I just think it's so important that we have that prayer and we have that vigilance, but it's not a guaranteed formula, is it? It's just because we pray a certain number of times, we do certain things, there's still that element of God's in control and God's in, so we just need to make sure we don't beat ourselves up when children don't follow Jesus. But for myself, if that doesn't happen, and I pray it does, I pray that all of them do. But I don't want to sit there and think, if only I'd done something, if only I'd put some time and effort into teaching them the Bible, if only we'd read the Bible daily, if only we'd done. So I don't want to be full of those sort of regrets. I'd rather have gone and said, look, they were clearly shown the gospel, they were given a good church, they were encouraged to go to the youth groups, and they've now got to stand between God and themselves.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you very much for sharing that. And thank you also for what you do putting this together. As you mentioned, we do have a bit of a breakup in this. This is not Steve's fault. This is the fault of the internet, just to make that clear. But no, thanks for sharing that. And hope you have a good few months over the summer, continuing to do what you're doing in terms of discipling. Yeah.
Bye.
Well, we are here today to do the book of Job, Colin. So let's talk about pain as a way into Job. When we meet pain in life, how do we deal with it? Just one example from my own life. I remember when a few years ago when my aunt died quite suddenly out of the blue. It was quite unexpected. I was just watching Braveheart at the time, alone in a flat, and I got the call. And I remember it really hit me, her loss, even though we weren't close, even though I hadn't seen her for a long, long time. And even though she could be quite a difficult person to warm to, it upset me much more than I thought it ever would. And when you taste that pain and that horror of a person being gone, it's horrible, isn't it? I'm sure many of us watching will have experienced something of that, perhaps in the last 6 months, perhaps bereavement, perhaps illness ourselves, perhaps living in pain. And when we taste pain like that, Colin, it does raise questions, doesn't it? Why is this happening to me? How do I make sense of it? And it raises questions about God too.
Yeah, I think it does. And as we look at the book of Job, you'll find Job himself struggling with all that went on in his life. And man, as we'll find out, he went through the mill in terms of suffering. But I think one of our problems is we don't know God that well, or don't trust him for who he is, that he's got everything under his control. And I think also there is this sort of overriding or default mechanism within us all that thinks, actually, we're pretty good and we don't deserve to receive anything bad in this life. As if, we shouldn't have any consequences for our sin and our rebellion. And so there's that aspect to it. But then there is also that, as you've mentioned, those sudden events, either nationally, internationally, or personally, that happen out of the blue and you just can't understand, particularly if you love them and if you consider them to be a really beneficial person. You think, why on earth has that happened? It seems so unfair when you see wicked people growing older and prospering. Yeah, so it raises quite a few issues.
It does raise a lot of issues. And I think it's even harder when you have unexplained suffering, or when you have particularly innocent suffering. So in the most general terms, approaching the topic of suffering from a Christian standpoint, we'd say that suffering exists in the world as a judgment on human sin in Adam collectively. Doesn't explain the individual bits of suffering necessarily that come into our lives. And there might be all sorts of reasons for that. And often the time we don't know, do we? We don't know why something is happening. And we're left with the problem of how can I trust God in the face of suffering which I don't understand, I don't think I deserve necessarily myself, or I can't explain. Why would he allow this? There's always the objection, isn't there, that you hear a lot about, if God's all powerful and he's all good, then he wouldn't allow suffering at all. But when people use that to then say, well, therefore a good all powerful God cannot exist, it doesn't solve the problem, does it? Because if you're saying a God doesn't exist and you get rid of him entirely, then all you're left with is a material universe, a meaningless world of matter and stuff and meaningless events which just happen, and there's no good or bad or right or wrong. Things just happen, and you've sawn off the branch of your own outrage and grief in the face of life's sufferings, haven't you? You're still left with the problem, and you've created a different problem. You just exchange one problem for another. And the situation with Job is that, well, he is someone who doesn't throw God out, but is left with the problem of saying, okay, I still believe God is there because of various reasons, but I've still got this problem of innocent suffering I can't understand, and that makes me really struggle to trust God. And that brings us on to the book of Job itself, because it's a masterpiece. It's philosophical, it's poetical, it's theological, it's pastoral. There's nothing like it in the rest of the Bible, really. 42 chapters of wisdom and poetry set within a story about an innocent man in pain, and whether God can be trusted in the face of unimaginable, unexplained agony. Is God big enough and good enough to be trusted in that kind of scenario? And the way it works is that the story sets up the question, doesn't it? Because we start off with Job being introduced as a good person. Not perfect, of course, but we're told he's blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. In other words, he's a believer in the Old Testament, and he is as good as a forgiven sinner can be. He trusts God, and he's living his life under God. There's no obvious sin which would invite any sort of specific judgment or punishment from God that would explain his suffering. And this innocent man, as you alluded to earlier, who's doing everything right, it seems, in life, is made to suffer. That's the riddle of the book. Horribly, he's made to suffer. He loses his wealth, he loses his business, he loses his children, he loses his servants, most of them, he loses his health and his comfort, and he ends up sitting on the ash heap, cutting his sores with a potsherd in his pain. A ruin of a man, when he hasn't done anything to deserve this specifically. And how will Job react? Will he still fear God? Was he only ever a fair weather worshipper? Did he believe some sort of version of the prosperity gospel, that you worship God and you trust him because that makes life good for you here and now? Is he only in it for the material benefits? Is he going to continue worshipping God when all the material benefits are stripped away? Will he be exposed as not really caring about God for God's sake at all? It's a very searching situation. Job is being tested. And will he trust God in the face of undeserved suffering? And the answer the book shows us through the chapters is, will Job trust God? Yes, then no, then yes. Yes, then no, then yes. Because he starts off really well, doesn't he, Colin? In chapter 1, he says exactly the right thing.
Yeah, we receive good from God, and shall we not receive bad? Also, something like that.
Yeah.
In this, he didn't say anything wrong.
Yeah, he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord's given, the Lord has taken away. The name of the Lord be praised. He praises God. He knows that God is deserving of his praise in good times and bad. And he knows that's the right answer initially. And then, after 7 days on the ash heap, he starts to stew. And the yes becomes a no. Because the impact of the loss seems to hit him in a way that's so human and recognizable. And as he chews over it, he starts to do what he didn't do at the start, which is to charge God, albeit indirectly at first, with wrongdoing. He starts to say something is seriously wrong here. God, you have made a mistake. You are committing a miscarriage of justice. I haven't done anything to deserve it, so you are at fault. And I want to summon you to court, and I want to have it out with you and show you that you are at fault and I am innocent. And therefore, you are the one in the wrong. And I thought we could hear this from his speeches, Colin. So could you read the Job chapter 10, first few verses of that, please, verses 1 to 7.
Yeah, we're reading 1 to 7, as Andy said. These are his words. I loathe my very life. Therefore, I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me, but tell me what charges you have against me. Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the schemes of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? Are your days like those of a mortal, or your years like those of a man, that you must search out my faults and probe after my sin? Though you know that I am not guilty, and that no one can rescue me from your hand. Your hands shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you molded me like clay. Will you now turn me to dust again? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Do you want me to do the second one now?
Yeah, could you read Job 23, please?
We'll do. We're reading all of this. Then Job replied to one of his friends, even today my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say. Would he oppose me with great power? No, he would not press charges against me. There an upright man could present his case before him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. But if I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. My feet have closely followed his steps. I have kept to his way without turning aside. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread. But he stands alone, and who can oppose him? He does whatever he pleases. He carries out his decree against me, and many such plans he still has in store. That is why I am terrified before him. When I think of all this, I fear him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. Yet I'm not silenced by the darkness, by the thick darkness that covers my face.
Thank you. And perhaps you can hear what is being said there. There's a lot of words, and there's a lot of words in the book of Job generally. But perhaps you can hear the frustration and the feelings he has towards God, the fear and terror from the fact that he wants to get to grips with God, and he wants to sit him down and have this meeting, and says, if only I knew where to find him, if only I could get to his dwelling place, I could sit him down, I could make him see sense, I could have it out with him, I could show him everything he's done wrong, I could lay it out on the table and all my good deeds and say, there you go, God. What do you make of this? And God would have to be forced to admit that Job was innocent and therefore God was wrong to make him suffer. That's the scenario Job wants. He wants a courtroom confrontation with God. Actually, at points in the book, he wishes for a mediator to set up such a meeting, to sort of force God to come to the table. And that's the attitude of Job. He's this sort of quite frustrated, angry prosecutor who's looking to charge God. And is Job wrong entirely, Colin? This is a difficult thing, isn't it? Because the speeches of the friends try and push back, because Job has three friends who argue back, and they try to push back against him, and they kind of get something right, but not everything right, don't they? And neither side is entirely correct.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're listening to Job from the other side of Jesus coming, haven't we, and all that he taught us. So when Job contends that he's innocent, certainly I think, well, actually, your heart isn't entirely pure, because nobody's heart is pure. And actually, the arguments that you're raising to God, though in the sight of others, you're beyond reproach, and you've kept God's laws seemingly, yet he's allowed the pain and the agony to fester, as you've sort of put it, and turn this outrage against God and this accusation against God. And that seems to be trying to raise himself above God himself and almost sit as judge, which is pride.
Well, yeah, this is a difficulty. That Job has Job sinned? Well, the prologue is clear. He hasn't done any specific sin to prompt the suffering that has come. So there's no sin behind the suffering. That's the issue. And yet the attitude Job expresses is not so much denying sin. He's sort of weaponizing his good deeds against God in some ways. And he's saying, look, I've kept your laws. I haven't done this. And he, towards the end of his of the cycle of speeches, he makes this point. He signs his declaration saying, if I've sinned in this department, you can squash me. If I've done that, if I've committed that, then you can take me down. But the fact is I haven't. And therefore he takes the next step, which is the wrong step, which is to say, because I haven't done anything to deserve this particular suffering, therefore, God, you are at fault. And this is where the friends push back, because their argument is, Job, you're suffering, therefore you must be at fault. You must be the one at fault. And both those arguments are sort of half right and half wrong, because the fact is, the friends are rebuked by God at the end. Specifically, here's the wonderful diagram to help you see this. Full screen. So there's a courtroom. The blue stuff is the facts. God is bringing suffering to Job. That is the reality of the situation. The explanation for that is the two red things. And the red thing on the left is Job's explanation. Job thinks, well, God is bringing suffering to me undeservedly, therefore God is at fault. Only explanation. God must be unjust. Friends on the right-hand side come to the opposite conclusion. They look at the same data set, God is bringing suffering to Job, but therefore they conclude, well, no, God can't be unjust, therefore Job must be unjust. Job must have done something. He must be in denial. He must be a secret sinner. And actually, the book shows both of those are wrong. That actually Job hasn't done a specific sin to deserve this suffering. And, as we will see, Job is wrong to say God is unjust. There are a bigger range of explanations at play here, some of which we don't fully understand. But those are the frustrations of the argument, because for chapters and chapters of Job, it's simply Job arguing with his friends. They're trying to blame him. He's trying to charge God with wrongdoing. And they're both sort of knocking each other out and falling over each other. And it's very frustrating. And eventually, it comes down to the issue of God's character, particularly with Job, isn't it? Because if Job is looking at the character of God and he's seeing that God, in his eyes, is doing wrong to him, then that is fatal to faith, isn't it? Your assessment of the character of God directly impacts whether you can trust him. If you believe he's good, if you believe he can be trusted with mysteries and problems and unanswered, unexplained suffering, then you can trust him. If you think he's doing evil to you, if you think he is a bad actor against you, or a bumbling human judge who allows miscarriages of justice and won't see justice done in the end, it's very hard to trust him. And this is why Job is such a battle for Job's faith. It's about the character of God, and can he trust God with this innocent suffering? And that's the issue that Job resolves as well at the end, because after all these arguments, we get to the bit at the end, the really majestic bit, the unexpected bit, when after chapters and chapters of going round and round this stuff, suddenly who should come on the scene? Who should appear? After Job's been demanding a meeting with God for chapters and he's been getting nothing, suddenly, out of the blue, who should appear on the scene but God himself? And the Almighty speaks to Job in chapter 38, quite unprompted, quite unnecessarily. He doesn't have to show up, but he chooses to show up. And he gives him the longed for face-to-face meeting. And Job has been hungry. Oh, if only I could sit God down and talk to him. God turns up. And in a wonderful reversal of the tables, the meeting just does not go to plan. And the situation is reverse, and it's glorious, because Job thinks, oh, I'm going to be laying into God, I'm going to be asking him all these questions, I'm going to be nailing him. And actually, it's God who asks Job the questions in this meeting. And Colin, perhaps you could read Job 38 and verses 1 to 13 when God starts speaking.
Yep, I'll do that. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no further. Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it?"
Such a dramatic moment as God unleashes a barrage of questions on Job and says, I'm sorry, Job, what do you know? What do you know about running the universe? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? You don't even understand how I made it, let alone how it is to be run. Have you ever given orders to the morning? On what were the footings set? Tell me if you so understand the world and you think I'm doing such a bad job of running it. I'd like to see you try, Job. And he goes on and he explains in this majestic passage about how even the task of justice itself. In the second set of God's speeches, he says, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? So I'd like to see you try and enact cosmic justice in the universe, Job. I'd like to see you try and punish the wicked while also achieving your good purposes, which are so complicated across millions of people and ages. I'd like to see you try. And when you can't even master nature, you can't even control the most powerful creatures on earth, these mighty creatures in creation we get in Job, which are totally beyond your control. God says, I alone am big enough. I alone am powerful enough. And I alone am enough. I have the right as creator and the ability as creator to run the universe. You do not. Remember who you are. Who is this that darkens my counsel? Who are you, Job? And he just puts him back in his place, doesn't he? And Job's response to this is to put his hand over his mouth and say, I spoke about things I did not understand. The charges are withdrawn, and he says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And I repent. Not repenting of a specific sin like the friends wanted him to do, which would have caused the suffering, but repenting of the idea that he needs to know the answer. Repenting of the idea that he can hold God to account and demand that God is in the wrong and that God make redress to him. Job's perspective of God is so much bigger now. He's seen who God is and he's seen his character. And it's such a moment where he realizes he can trust him. And this, Colin, is so fascinating because we never get the answers, or Job never gets the answer about why he suffered, does he?
No. Well, these things were written for your sake, we were told in the New Testament.
For our sake, yeah.
Yeah. So that isn't an answer, but it tells us a little bit why this book's in there.
Yeah. And for the character of Job himself, he doesn't get that benefit. He never understands the way the reader does why he suffers. But he gets to a point where he doesn't need to. He gets to a point where he can trust God because God is big enough and God is good enough. And he recognizes his limitations and the limitations of his perspective. And so he moves in full circle from, can I trust God? No. Well, yes at the start and then no. And then back to yes again at the end. And he trusts God. And he withdraws the charge of wrongdoing from God. And in that way, Job doesn't answer or explain all suffering. It doesn't answer that, but it does give us God and say God is enough to be trusted. And that's the application that really carries across for us, I think, because Job paves the way for Jesus. He paves the way for the other great innocent sufferer in the Bible, the innocent sufferer who suffered through no fault of his own, and yet who could trust God and trust his Father through that, and never charge him with wrongdoing, and never complain, but trust his Father even as he suffered. And the thing is that we understand why Jesus suffered. We understand that bit of suffering. We don't understand every bit of suffering in our lives, but we understand the bit that God wants us to know about, which is why Jesus suffered. And that was because on the cross, he was suffering in the place of others to take our sins upon himself, so that we might be forgiven of all our sin. And in that way, Job paves the way, the possibility, if you like, the very surprising possibility that an innocent person could suffer for the purposes of God. Job establishes that this can happen and brings Job to a point where he can trust God that that's the case. And that prepares us for Jesus, because the whole gospel works by an innocent sufferer trusting God through their suffering, and so winning redemption and rescue for all of us. And I wonder whether there's a reminder there for us, an application for us, Colin, about the cross and about how it shows us that we can trust God with unexplained suffering because we understand the explained suffering of Jesus. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think with the whole issue of suffering, you do have to look at Jesus. But with these, and so he does help to quiet some of our angst, our suffering, because we don't endure anything like what he endured, and our lives actually, in comparison to his, are obviously tarnished. I think another interesting thing from what you were saying in Job is this polarization of either God's in the wrong or you're in the wrong, Job, and how we, as we want answers, and so we tend to plump for one or the other. And God is far more complex, and there's far more to know about him than to sort of tie him down to these, he's either this or he's either that, and to seek to trust him with the apparent contradictions that we feel about who he is and how he's acting in the world. Yeah. I don't know if that's answered your question exactly, but those are some thoughts on it.
Pastorally, this is a big topic for people, isn't it? In suffering. And I think there's no, there are few remedies or few helps than actually reading Job 38 onwards out loud as God speaks, and listen to how God helped Job with his suffering, and how Job's perspective changed, and pray that God would speak to you through that. I think that would be a great suggestion if you're someone who's struggling with these things, and see God like Job did, perceive him as God reveals himself through his word. And our prayer is that you will see that he is enough to be trusted, and good enough to be trusted, and powerful enough to be trusted, even with the biggest problems and the biggest suffering. Well, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining us. And until next time, stay close to Jesus.
And wash your hands.